2015. The Secretary also updates the current ESEA general regulations to include requirements for the submission of state plans under ESEA programs, including optional consolidated state plans. Dates. These regulations are effective January 30th, 2017. For further information, contact Meredith Miller, U.S. Department of Education, 400 Maryland Avenue, SW, Room 3C106, Washington, District of Columbia, 20202-2800. Telephone 202-401-8368 or by email meredith.miller@ed.gov. If you use a telecommunications device for the deaf, TDD, or a text telephone, TTY, call the Federal Relay Service, FRS, toll-free, at 1-800-877-8339. Supplementary information. Executive summary purpose of this regulatory action. On December 10, 2015, President Barack Obama signed the ESA into law. The ESA reauthorizes the ESEA, which provides federal funds to improve elementary and secondary education in the nation's public schools. The ESA builds on the ESEA's legacy as a civil rights law and seeks to ensure that every child, regardless of race, income, background, or where they live, has the opportunity to obtain a high-quality education. Through the reauthorization, the ESA made significant changes to the ESEA for the first time since the ESEA was reauthorized through the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, NCLB, including significant changes to Title I. One note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the Accountability in State Plans final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the Accountability in State Plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. In particular, the ESA significantly modified the accountability requirements of the ESEA, whereas the ESEA, as amended by the NCLB, required a state educational agency, SEA, to hold schools accountable based solely on results on statewide assessments and one other academic indicator. The SEA, as amended by the ESA, requires each SEA to have an accountability system that is state-determined and based on multiple indicators, including, but not limited to, at least one indicator of school quality or student success and, at a state's discretion, an indicator of student growth. The ESA also significantly modified the requirements for differentiating among schools and the basis on which schools must be identified for further comprehensive or targeted support and improvement. Additionally, the ESA no longer requires a particular sequence of escalating interventions in Title I schools that are identified and continue to fail to make adequate yearly progress, AYP. Instead, it gives seasoned local educational agencies (LEAs) discretion to determine the evidence-based interventions that are appropriate to address the needs of identified schools. In addition to modifying the ESEA requirements for state accountability systems, the ESA also modified and expanded upon the ESEA requirements for states and LEA report cards. The ESA continues to require that report cards be concise, presented in an understandable and uniform format, and, to the extent practicable, in a language that parents can understand, but now also requires that they be developed in consultation with parents and that they be widely accessible to the public. The ESA also requires that report cards include additional information that was not required to be included on report cards under the ESEA, as amended by the NCLB, such as information regarding per-pupil expenditures of federal, state, and local funds, the number and percentage of students enrolled in preschool programs, where available, the rate at which high school graduates enroll in post-secondary education programs, information regarding the number and percentage of English learners achieving English language proficiency, ELP, and certain data collected through the Civil Rights Data Collection, CRDC. In addition, the ESA requires that report cards include certain information for subgroups of students for which information was not previously required to be reported. including homeless students, students in foster care, and students with a parent who is a member of the armed forces. Further, the SEA, as amended by the ESA, authorizes an SEA to submit, if it so chooses, a consolidated state plan or consolidated state application for covered programs, and authorizes the Secretary to establish, for each covered program, the descriptions, information, assurances, and other material required to be included in a consolidated state plan or consolidated state application. On May 31, 2016, the Secretary published a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, NPRM, for the Title I, Part A program and General SEA regulations in the Federal Register, 81 FR 34539. We issue these regulations to provide clarity and support to Cs, LEs, and schools as they implement the SEA, as amended by the ESA, particularly the SEA requirements regarding accountability systems, state and LEA report cards, and consolidated state plans, and to ensure that key requirements in Title I of the SEA, as amended by the ESA, are implemented consistent with the purpose of the law, to provide all children significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education, and to close educational achievement gaps. 2. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the Accountability and State Plans final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the Accountability and State Plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. Summary of the major provisions of this regulatory action. The following is a summary of the major substantive changes in these final regulations from the regulations proposed in the NPRM. The rationale for each of these changes is discussed in the Analysis of Comments and Changes section of this document. Section 200.12 has been revised to clarify that if an authorized public chartering agency, consistent with state charter school law, acts to decline to renew or to revoke a charter for a particular charter school, the decision of the agency to do so supersedes any notification from the state that the school must implement a comprehensive or targeted support and improvement planned under paragraph 200.21 or 200.22. The Department made a number of changes to paragraph 200.13, which describes the state's long-term goals and measurements of interim progress for achievement, graduation rates, and progress toward ELP for English learners. Combining long stroke overlay, section 200.13a is revised to clarify that long-term goals and measurements of interim progress for academic achievement must measure the percentage of students attaining grade-level proficiency on the state's annual assessments in reading, language arts, and mathematics based on the state's academic achievement standards under section 1111b1 of the SEA, as amended by the ESA, including alternate academic achievement standards for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities as defined by the state under section 1111b1e of the SEA. Combining long stroke overlay, section 200.13c requires states to establish long-term goals and measurements of interim progress for increases in the percentage of English learners making annual progress toward attaining ELP using a uniform procedure applied to all English learners in a consistent manner, that establishes applicable timelines for English learners sharing particular characteristics to attain ELP after a student's identification and student-level targets within that timeline. The final rule is revised to require each state, in its state plan, to describe how it sets research-based, student-level targets, a rationale for a state-determined maximum number of years in its uniform procedure, and the applicable timelines over which English learners sharing particular characteristics are expected to attain ELP. In paragraph 200.14, which describes the requirements related to the 5 indicators: academic achievement, academic progress, graduation rate, progress in achieving English language proficiency, and school quality or student success, within the statewide accountability system, The final regulations include the following significant changes. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.14b1I2 is reorganized and revised to clarify that the academic achievement indicator 1 must include a grade level proficiency measure based on the state's academic achievement standards under section 1111b1 of the ESEA, including alternate academic achievement standards for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities as defined by the state under section 1111b1e of the ESEA. 2 may include measures of student performance below or above the proficient level, e.g., in an achievement index, so long as a school receives less credit for the performance of a student who is not yet proficient than for the performance of a student who is proficient, and the credit a school receives for the performance of a more advanced student does not fully compensate for the performance of a student that is not yet proficient, and 3 does not require state assessments in reading, language arts, and mathematics that are equally measured. 3. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the Accountability in State Plans final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the Accountability in State Plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.14b1 and 3 is revised to ensure that the academic achievement and graduation rate indicators are based on the corresponding long-term goals under paragraph 200.13. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.14c4 is revised to remove the requirement that a given measure may be used no more than once across the accountability indicators. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.14d is revised to clarify that states must demonstrate that measures in the academic progress and school quality or student success indicators are supported by research, that high performance or improvement on such measures is likely to increase students' learning, e.g., grade point average, credit accumulation, or performance in advanced coursework, or, for measures at the high school level, graduation rates, post-secondary enrollment, post-secondary persistence or completion, or career readiness. Section 200.15, which describes the requirements related to participation in statewide assessments and the annual measurement of achievement, is revised as follows. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.15a is revised to clarify the distinction between the statutory requirement for states to administer assessments to all students and the statutory requirement for states to measure, for accountability purposes, whether at least 95% of all students and of each subgroup of students participated in state assessments. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.15b2 IV is revised so that a state may develop and use a state-determined action or set of actions that is sufficiently rigorous to improve the school's participation rate in order to factor the statutory requirement for 95% participation on statewide assessments into its accountability system, rather than requiring such actions to be equally rigorous and result in a similar outcome as other possible options. In paragraph 200.16, which describes the requirements related to inclusion of subgroups of students, the final regulations include the following significant changes. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.16b is revised to permit a student previously identified as a child with a disability to be included in the Children with Disabilities subgroup for up to 2 years following the year in which the student exits special education services, for the limited purpose of measuring indicators that use results from required state assessments under section 1111b2 BVI of the ESEA, as amended by the ESA. A state choosing to include former children with disabilities for these indicators must include all such students, for the same period of time, and must also include all such students in determining whether the subgroup meets the state's size for purposes of calculating any such indicator. Combining long stroke overlay, section 200.16c1 is revised to allow former English learners to be included in the English learner subgroup for up to 4 years following the year in which the student achieves English language proficiency consistent with the standardized, statewide exit procedures. When measuring any indicator under paragraph 200.14b that uses data from required assessments under section 1111b2 of the ESEA, as amended by the ESA. Section 200.17 is revised to clarify that if a state proposes to use an N size above 30 students, the justification it provides in its state plan must include data on the number and percentage of schools that will not be held accountable for the performance of each subgroup of students described in paragraph 200.16a compared to such data if the state had selected an N size of 30. Within section 200.18, the department made the following substantial revisions from the fore. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the accountability and state plans final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the accountability and state plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. NPRM, primarily to better align requirements for differentiation in paragraph 200.18 with requirements for identification of schools in paragraph 200.19. Combining long stroke overlay, section 200.18 is renamed to clarify all of the components within annual meaningful differentiation of schools. Performance levels, data dashboards, summative determinations, and indicator weighting. Combining long stroke overlay, section 200.18a2-3 describes the requirements for each state to describe the school's level of performance on each accountability indicator, from among 3 performance levels that are distinct, aligned to a state's long-term goals, and clear and understandable to the public. The final rule clarifies that the levels must also be discrete, indicating that reporting on a continuous measure, e.g., scale scores, would not meet the requirement, and that a data dashboard is an example of a way for a state to report performance levels for a school. Combining long stroke overlay, section 200.18a4 specifies that a state must provide each school with a single summative determination from among at least 3 categories, based on all of the accountability indicators. We are revising the final regulation to clarify that a state may either use 1. Determinations that include the 2 categories of schools required to be identified in paragraph 200.19, i.e., schools identified for comprehensive support and improvement and targeted support and improvement, and the 3rd category of unidentified schools, or 2. Determinations distinct from the categories of schools described in paragraph 200.19. We are also revising paragraph 200.18a4 to clarify that the summative determination must meaningfully differentiate between schools based on differing performance on the indicators and provide information on a school's overall performance in a clear and understandable manner on annual report cards. Combining long stroke overlay, section 200.18a6 is revised to clarify that annual meaningful differentiation must inform the state's methodology to identify schools under paragraph 200.19, including identification of consistently underperforming subgroups of students. Combining long stroke overlay, section 200.18c3 is revised to require each state to demonstrate that a school with a consistently underperforming subgroup will receive a lower summative determination than it would have otherwise received if the school had no consistently underperforming subgroups. Combining long stroke overlay, section 200.18d1-2 is revised to require each state to demonstrate in its state plan that schools that are low performing on indicators afforded substantial weight are more likely to be identified under paragraph 200.19. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 200.18d13 incorporates provisions from the proposed state plan regulations to clarify that a state may develop and propose to use alternate methods for differentiation and identification under paragraph 200.18, in order to ensure all public schools are included, such as schools in which no grades are assessed, schools with variant grade configurations, small schools, newly opened schools, and schools designed to serve special populations of students, e.g., newcomer English learners, students receiving alternative programming in alternative educational settings, and students living in local institutions for neglected or delinquent children, including juvenile justice facilities. The department made several changes to paragraph 200.19, primarily for clarification or to align requirements with other sections of the regulations. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 200.19a1 is revised to clarify that each state must identify the lowest performing 5% of all Title I schools, not 5% of Title I schools at each grade span, and to make conforming changes based on the significant changes under paragraph 200.18. 5. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the accountability and state plans final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the accountability and state plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 200.19a3 is revised to allow each state to determine how long a school with a low-performing subgroup identified for targeted support and improvement that also must receive additional targeted support under paragraph 200.19b2 may implement a targeted support plan before the state must determine that such a school has not met the state's exit criteria and must, if it receives Title I funds, be identified for comprehensive support and improvement. A corresponding change is made to paragraph 200.22 F2. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 200.19b2 is revised to clarify that a state must use the same process to identify schools with individual subgroups performing at or below the performance of all students in the lowest performing 5% of Title I schools as it uses to identify the lowest performing 5% of Title I schools for comprehensive support and improvement. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 200.19c1 is revised to allow a state, in order to identify schools with one or more consistently underperforming subgroups, to consider a school's performance among each subgroup of students in the school over more than 2 years, if the state demonstrates that a longer time frame will better support low-performing subgroups of students to make significant progress in achieving long-term goals and measurements of interim progress in order to close statewide proficiency and graduation rate gaps, consistent with Section 1111C4AI3 of the ESEA, as amended by the ESA, and paragraph 200.13. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 200.19c3I is revised to ensure that when a state chooses a definition for consistently underperforming subgroups that considers a subgroup's performance on the state's measurements of interim progress or state-designed long-term goals, the SEA also considers a school's performance on the indicators for which goals and measurements of interim progress are not required, consistent with the requirement that the state's definition be based on all indicators. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 200.19c3 is revised to remove options for a state to define a consistently underperforming subgroup of students based on indicator performance levels, a single measure within an indicator, or performance gaps between the subgroup and state averages as described in proposed paragraph 200.19c32 IV. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.19 D1I2 is revised to allow a state to delay identification of schools for comprehensive support and improvement in schools with a low-performing subgroup for targeted support and improvement that also must receive additional targeted support until no later than the beginning of the 2018-2019 school year. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.19 D13 is revised to allow a state to delay identification of schools with consistently underperforming subgroups for targeted support and improvement until no later than the beginning of the 2019-2020 school year. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.19 D2 is revised to clarify that for each year in which a state must identify schools for comprehensive or targeted support and improvement, it must do so using data from the preceding school year, except that the state may use adjusted cohort graduation rate data from the year immediately prior to the preceding school year. The department made revisions to paragraph 200.20 for clarity, including combining long stroke overlay section 200.20a is revised to use consistent terminology for how states can produce average results by combining data across both school years and grades within a school, and to clarify that a state combining data must sum the total number of students in each subgroup of students described in paragraph 200.16a2 across all school years when calculating a school 6. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the Accountability in State Plans final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the Accountability in State Plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. Performance on each indicator under paragraph 200.20a is revised to clarify the limited purposes in the accountability system for which states may average school-level data across school years. Within sections paragraph 200.21 and 200.22, comprehensive support and improvement and targeted support and improvement, the department made the following substantial revisions from the NPRM, primarily to strengthen and clarify the requirements for school improvement. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.21 C4 is revised to require that an LEA, in conducting a school level needs assessment for each school within the LEA identified for comprehensive support and improvement, consider a school's unmet needs, including with respect to students, school leadership and instruction staff, quality of the instructional program, family and community involvement, school climate, and distribution of resources. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.21 D1 is revised to clarify that for LEAs affected by section 8538 of the ESEA, the LEA must develop school improvement plans in partnership with Indian tribes, among other required stakeholders. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.21 D1 and similar requirements in paragraph 200.15 C1I and 200.22 C1 is revised to encourage the involvement of students, as appropriate, in developing school improvement plans. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.21 D3 is revised to clarify examples of interventions that an LEA may consider implementing in an identified school, and to clarify optional state authorities for state-approved lists of interventions or state-determined interventions, further described in paragraph 200.23 C. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.21 D3 VI is revised to clarify that differentiated improvement activities that utilize evidence-based interventions may be used in high schools that primarily serve students returning to education or who, based on their grade or age, are significantly off track to accumulate sufficient academic credits to meet state high school graduation requirements. Combining long stroke overlay sections 200.21 D4 and 200.22 C7I are revised to require that LEAs, in identifying and addressing resource inequities in schools identified for comprehensive support and improvement, or schools with a low-performing subgroup identified for targeted support and improvement that also must receive additional targeted support, respectively, must review access to advanced coursework, access to full-day kindergarten programs and preschool programs, and access to specialized instructional support personnel. Combining long stroke overlay consistent with the revisions to paragraph 200.21 D3 VI. Paragraph 200.21 G is revised to clarify state discretion to exclude very small high schools from developing and implementing a support and improvement plan if such schools are identified as a low graduation rate high school under paragraph 200.19 A2. Combining long stroke overlay sections 200.21 F and 200.22 F are revised to require that each SEA make its state-established exit criteria publicly available. The department has revised paragraph 200.23 as follows. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.23A is revised to clarify that in periodically reviewing resources available for each LEA in the state serving a significant number or percentage of schools identified for comprehensive or targeted support and improvement, the state must consider each of the resources in its review that is listed in paragraph 200.21 D4 IAE and consider resources in 7. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the Accountability and State Plan's final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the Accountability and State Plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. Such LEAs as compared to all other LEAs in the state and in schools in those LEAs as compared to all other schools in the state. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.23 C1 is revised to list examples of additional actions a state may take to initiate improvement at the LEA level, or, consistent with state charter school law, in an authorized public chartering agency that serves a significant number or percentage of schools identified for comprehensive support and improvement and that are not meeting exit criteria, or a significant number or percentage of schools in targeted support and improvement. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.23 C1 is revised to clarify that any action to revoke or non-renew a school's charter must be taken in coordination with the applicable authorized public chartering agency and be consistent with both state charter school law and the terms of the school's charter. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.23 C3 is revised to clarify the distinction between this provision and a related provision in paragraph 200.23 C2. The final regulations give states flexibility to establish evidence-based interventions for use by LEAs and schools identified for support and improvement, either by creating lists of state-approved evidence-based interventions for use in any identified school, or by developing their own alternative evidence-based interventions that may be used specifically in comprehensive support and improvement schools. The department has made the following significant changes to paragraph 200.24, which describes requirements for school improvement funding under section 1003 of the ESEA. Combining long stroke overlay section paragraph 200.24 C2 is revised to clarify that a state may award a grant of less than the minimum award size if the state determines that a smaller amount is appropriate based on the school's enrollment, identified needs, selected evidence-based interventions, and other relevant factors described in the LEA's application. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.24 C43A is revised to require that a state consider, in determining strongest commitment, both the proposed use of evidence-based interventions that are supported by the strongest level of evidence available, and whether the evidence-based interventions are sufficient to support the school in making progress toward meeting the applicable exit criteria under paragraph 200.21 or 200.22. The department revised paragraph 200.30 for clarity, including as follows: combining long stroke overlay section 200.30e is revised to provide for a state to delay inclusion of per pupil expenditure data on its report card until no later than June 30th following the December 31st deadline for reporting all other information required under section 1111H of the ESEA, as amended by the ESA. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.30E32 is revised to clarify that a state requesting a one-time, one-year extension of the December 31st deadline for disseminating report cards must submit a plan and timeline for how it will meet the December 31st deadline for report cards that include information from the 2018-2019 school year. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.30 F1 IV clarifies that students in the subgroup of student with a parent who is a member of the armed forces include students whose parents are on full-time National Guard duty. Further, paragraph 200.30 F1 IV-C defines full-time National Guard duty. The department revised paragraph 200.31 for clarity, including as follows: 8. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the Accountability in State Plans final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the Accountability and State Plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.31 B3 removes the page limit requirement on the LEA overview for each school served by the LEA. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.31 E is revised to provide for an LEA to delay inclusion of per pupil expenditure data until no later than June 30th following the December 31st deadline for reporting all other information required under section 1111H of the ESEA, as amended by the ESA. The department revised paragraph 200.34, which provides the requirements on how to calculate the adjusted cohort graduation rate, including the following significant changes. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.34 A33 is revised to clarify the requirements for removing a student entering a prison or juvenile justice facility from a sending school's cohort. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.34 A5 is added to clarify that a state must include students with the most significant cognitive disabilities who receive a state-defined alternate diploma in the calculation of the adjusted cohort graduation rate in the year in which they exit, and describes how they should be treated in the numerator and the denominator. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.34 C2 is revised to clarify that a diploma based on meeting a student's individualized education program (IEP) goals is considered a lesser credential. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.34 D2 is revised to remove language limiting and extend the year graduation rate to 7 years. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.34 E2 is added to describe the criteria a state must use to include students in the following subgroups in the graduation rate calculation: English learners, children with disabilities, children who are homeless, and children who are in foster care. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.34 EF has been removed and revised requirements have been placed in paragraph 200.34 A5. The department has revised paragraph 200.35 for clarity, including combining long stroke overlay section 200.35 A and B has been revised to clarify that state and LEA report cards must report the total current expenditures that were not reported in school level per pupil expenditure figures. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.35 A and B has been revised to clarify that state and LEA report cards must, when reporting per pupil expenditures, include with state and local funds all federal funds intended to replace local tax revenues. Combining long stroke overlay section 200.35 C2 has been revised to clarify the denominator used for purposes of calculating per pupil expenditures must be the same figure as reported to the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES, on or about October 1st. The department made a number of changes to paragraph 299.13, which provides an overview of the state plan requirements. Combining long stroke overlay section 299.13 C2 is revised to require that an SEA ensures that LEAs will collaborate with local child welfare agencies to develop and implement clear written procedures that ensure children in foster care receive transportation to and from their school of origin when in their best interest. Combining long stroke overlay section 299.13 C3 was moved from proposed paragraph 299.18 C to require an SEA to assure that it will publish and update specific educator equity information and data regarding ineffective, out-of-field, and inexperienced teachers. Combining long stroke overlay section 299.13 D3 is revised to allow an SEA to request a 3-year extension, rather than 9. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the accountability and state plans final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the accountability and state plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. The 2-year extension originally proposed to calculate statewide rates of educator equity data using school-level data when meeting the requirements of paragraph 299.18 C3I. Combining long stroke overlay. The department made the following changes in paragraph 299.14, which describes the framework and the requirements when submitting a consolidated state plan. Combining long stroke overlay section 299.14 C was added to include consolidated state plan assurances on coordination of federal programs, challenging academic standards and assessments, state support and improvement for low-performing schools, participation for private school children and teachers, and appropriate identification of children with disabilities. With the exception of the assurance regarding participation for private school children and teachers, the required assurances were previously required descriptions in the proposed consolidated state plan requirements, with revisions made in order to reduce unnecessary burden on each SEA. The department made the following changes in paragraph 299.15, which describes the requirements related to consultation on the consolidated state plan. Combining long stroke overlay section 299.15 is revised to include 2 additional stakeholder groups with whom an SEA must consult in developing its consolidated state plan: representatives of private school students and early childhood educators and leaders, and to clarify that the stakeholder groups listed in paragraph 299.15 A represent the minimum stakeholder groups with whom an SEA is expected to consult. Combining long stroke overlay section 299.15 is further revised such that paragraph 299.15 B no longer includes the proposed requirement that each SEA describe its plans for coordinating across federal educational laws. Section 299.15 B now includes the performance management requirements, which only require an SEA to describe its performance management system once, and not for each component of its consolidated state plan. Combining long stroke overlay. The department made a number of changes to paragraph 299.16, which describes the requirements related to challenging academic assessments, including Combining long stroke overlay, the final regulations do not require a state that elects to submit a consolidated state plan to provide evidence in such plan related to challenging academic content standards and aligned academic achievement standards, alternate academic achievement standards, as applicable, or ELP standards, but rather, in paragraph 299.14, C2, requires the SEA to assure that it will meet the statutory requirements. Specifically, the assurance in paragraph 299.14 C2 clarifies that a state that elects to submit a consolidated related to alternate academic achievement standards and alternate assessments for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities and ELP standards and assessments. Combining long stroke overlay, the final regulations do not require an SEA that elects to submit a consolidated state plan to provide evidence in such plan related to a state's academic assessments, including providing the names of such assessments and evidence that such assessments meet the requirements under Section 1111B2 of the SEA and applicable regulations. Rather, the SEA must provide an assurance under paragraph 299.14 C2 that it will meet the statutory requirements related to a state's academic assessments. Combining long stroke overlay, proposed paragraph 299.16 B7 has been removed, and the department will not require an SEA 10 state plan will meet the statutory requirements in Section 1111B1A, F, and 1111B2 of the Act, including requirements. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the Accountability in State Plans final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the Accountability and State Plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable, to describe in its consolidated state plan how it will use funds under Section 1201 of the ESEA. The department has revised some provisions in paragraph 299.17 for clarification and alignment with revisions to other provisions in the final regulations as follows. Combining long stroke overlay, section 299.17a clarifies that, with respect to its state design long-term goals under paragraph 200.13, an SEA must both provide its baseline, measurements of interim progress, and long-term goals, and describe how it established its long-term goals and measurements of interim progress. Combining long stroke overlay, section 299.17 B5 IV clarifies that an SEA must describe, among other elements as noted in paragraph 299.17 B, how its methodology for differentiating all public schools in the state meets the requirements under paragraph 200.18 C3 and D1-2. Combining long stroke overlay, section 299.17 B8 incorporates the requirements for an SEA to describe how it includes all public schools in the state in its accountability system if it is different from the methodology described in paragraph 299.17 B5, consistent with paragraph 200.18 D1-3. Combining long stroke overlay, section 299.17 D2 is revised to include a description of how an SEA will provide technical assistance to each LEA in the state serving a significant number or percentage of schools identified for comprehensive or targeted support and improvement, including how it will provide technical assistance to LEAs to ensure the effective implementation of evidence-based interventions, consistent with paragraph 200.23 B. Combining long stroke overlay, section 299.17 D4 is revised to require an SEA to describe how it will periodically review, identify, and, to the extent practicable, address resources available in LEAs serving a significant number or percentage of comprehensive or targeted support and improvement schools consistent with paragraph 200.23a. The department made a number of changes in paragraph 299.18 which provides the requirements related to supporting excellent educators as follows. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 299.18a is amended to clarify that an SEA need only describe the state's system of certification and licensure, its strategies to improve educator preparation programs, and its strategies for professional growth and improvements for educators that addresses induction, development, compensation, and advancement if it intends to use federal funds for these purposes. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 299.18b is amended to remove the list of student subgroups that was provided in proposed paragraph 299.18b2. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 299.18c is amended to clarify that an SEA must describe whether there are differences in the rates at which low-income and minority students are taught by ineffective, out-of-field, or inexperienced teachers. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 299.18c5 is revised to clarify that an SEA must identify likely causes of the most significant differences in the rates at which low-income and minority students are taught by ineffective, out-of-field, or inexperienced teachers. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 299.18c5(2) is revised to clarify that an SEA must prioritize strategies to address the most significant differences in the rates at which low-income and minority students are taught by ineffective, out-of-field, or inexperienced teachers. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 299.18c5(3) is revised so that an SEA must include its timeline and interim targets for eliminating any differences in the rates at which low-income and minority 11. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the Accountability and State Plan's final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the Accountability and State Plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. Students are taught by ineffective, out-of-field, or inexperienced teachers. The Department made a number of changes in paragraph 299.19, which provides the requirements for an SEA to describe how it will ensure well-rounded and supportive education for all students, including the following. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 299.19a(1) is amended to clarify that state must describe use of Title IV, Part A funds and funds from other included programs, including strategies to support the continuum of a student's preschool 12 education and to ensure all students have access to a well-rounded education. Such description must include how the SEA considered the academic and non-academic needs of the subgroups of students identified in paragraph 299.19a(1)(3). Combining long stroke overlay, Section 299.19a(2) is revised to clarify that a state need only describe its strategies to support least to improve school conditions for student learning, effectively use technology, and engage families, parents, and communities if the state uses Title IV, Part A funds or funds from one or more of the included programs for such activities. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 299.19a(2) removes the requirement for a state to describe how it will ensure the accurate identification of English learners. Section 299.19b(4) retains the requirement for each SEA to describe its standardized entrance and exit procedures for English learners. Combining long stroke overlay, Section 299.19b(3) is revised to include program-specific requirements for Title I, Part 500 that requires each SEA to provide a plan for assisting the transition of children and youth between correctional facilities and locally operated programs, and the description of the program objectives and outcomes that will be used to assess the effectiveness of the program. Please refer to the Analysis of Comments on Changes section of this preamble for a detailed discussion of the comments received and any changes made in the final regulations. Costs and benefits. The Department believes that the benefits of this regulatory action outweigh any associated costs to seize and lease, which may be financed with federal grant funds. These benefits include a more flexible, less complex and costly accountability framework for the implementation of the SEA, as amended by the ESA, that respects state and local decision-making, the efficient and effective collection and dissemination of a wide range of education-related data that will inform state and local decision-making, and an optional, streamlined consolidated application process that will promote the comprehensive and coordinated use of federal, state, and local resources to improve educational outcomes for all students and all subgroups of students. Please refer to the Regulatory Impact Analysis section of this document for a more detailed discussion of costs and benefits, including changes in estimated costs in response to public comment. Consistent with Executive Order 12,866, the Secretary has determined that this action is economically significant and, thus, is subject to review by the Office of Management and Budget under the order. Public comment. In response to our invitation to comment in the NPRM, 21,609 parties submitted comments on the proposed regulations. We discussed substantive issues under the sections of the proposed regulations to which they pertain, with the exception of a number of cross-cutting issues, which are discussed together under the heading, Cross-Cutting Issues. Generally, we do not address technical and other 12. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the Accountability and State Plan's final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the Accountability and State Plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. Minor changes, or suggested changes the law does not authorize us to make under the applicable statutory authority. In addition, we do not address general comments that raised concerns not directly related to the proposed regulations or that were otherwise outside the scope of the regulations, including comments that raised concerns pertaining to particular sets of academic standards or the department's authority to require a state to adopt a particular set of academic standards, as well as comments pertaining to the department's regulations on statewide assessments. Tribal consultation. The department held 4 tribal consultation sessions on April 24th, April 28th, May 12th, and June 27th, 2016, pursuant to Executive Order 13,175, consultation and coordination with Indian tribal governments. The purpose of these tribal consultation sessions was to solicit tribal input on the SEA, as amended by the ESA, including input on several changes that the ESA made to the SEA that directly affect Indian students and tribal communities. The department specifically sought input on the new grant program for Native language immersion schools and projects, the report on Native American language medium education, and the report on responses to Indian student suicides. The department announced the tribal consultation sessions via lists or emails and website postings on http://www.edtribalconsultations.org/. During the consultation session held on June 27, 2016, which was held during the public comment period, the attendees discussed a range of topics pertaining to the SEA, as amended by the ESA, many of which related to provisions and titles of the law that fall outside the scope of these regulations. We do not address those comments in these regulations, but we are continuing to consider them in accordance with the department's tribal consultation policy. which is available at http://www.edtribalconsultations.org/documents/tribal consultation policy final 2015.pdf. A number of participants at the June 27, 2016 consultation session provided input pertaining to these regulations. For example, a number of participants expressed concerns about the consultation, or lack of consultation, conducted by states and districts with local tribes. Participants wished to be more involved in the development of state and local policies that affect Native students. A few participants expressed specific concerns that the proposed regulation regarding the minimum number of students that must be in a subgroup for that subgroup to be included in accountability determinations would not ensure that Native students were included in accountability determinations to the maximum extent possible. The department considered the input provided during the first 3 consultation sessions in developing the proposed requirements. We considered input from the June 27, 2016 tribal consultation session on the topics that are within the scope of these regulations, as part of public comments received on the NPRM. We respond to the comments from that session that are within the scope of these regulations under the sections of the proposed regulations to which they pertain. Analysis of comments and changes. An analysis of the comments and changes in the regulations since publication of the NPRM follows. 13. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the Accountability and State Plans final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the Accountability and State Plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. Cross-cutting issues legal authority comments. A number of commenters asserted that these regulations constitute an overreach by the department because the regulations include requirements pertaining to topics on which the SEA, as amended by the ESA, delegates authority to states and LEAs. A number of commenters cited specific statutory provisions that are intended to limit the department's authority to create new requirements or criteria for statewide accountability systems beyond those specifically enumerated in the ESEA, as amended by the ESA. Some of these commenters contended that any regulatory requirement that is not specifically authorized by the statute and that establishes parameters for how states or LEAs implement the law exceeds the department's authority and violates the statute. Discussion. Section 410 of the General Education Provisions Act, GEPA, 20 U.S.C. paragraph 1221 times 10 to the -3rd, authorizes the Secretary, in order to carry out functions otherwise vested in the Secretary by law or by delegation of authority pursuant to law, to make, promulgate, issue, rescind, and amend rules and regulations governing the manner of operations of, and governing the applicable programs administered by, the Department. Section 414 of the Department of Education Organization Act, DEOA, similarly authorizes the Secretary to prescribe such rules and regulations as the Secretary determines necessary or appropriate to administer and manage the functions of the Secretary or the Department. 20 U.S.C. 3474. Section 1601A of the ESEA, as amended by the ESA, bolsters this general authority through an additional grant of authority for the Secretary to issue regulations under Title I of the ESEA. That provision states that the Secretary may issue such regulations as are necessary to reasonably ensure that there is compliance with this title. Further, Section 8302A1 of the ESEA, as amended by the ESA, authorizes the Secretary to establish procedures and criteria for the submission of consolidated state plans. The provisions of these regulations are wholly consistent with the Department's rulemaking authority. In particular, Section 1001 of the ESEA, as amended by the ESA, establishes the purpose of Title I of the statute, which is to provide all children significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education, and to close educational achievement gaps. In furtherance of that goal, Section 1111A requires any state that desires to receive a grant under Title I, Part A to file with the Secretary a plan that meets certain specified requirements, which may be submitted as part of a consolidated plan under Section 8302 of the SEA. Section 1111C1 of the SEA requires each state plan to describe a statewide accountability system that complies with the requirements of subsections 1111C and 1111D. In addition, Section 1111H1 of the SEA requires a state that receives assistance under Title I, Part A to prepare and disseminate widely to the public an annual state report card for the state as a whole that meets the requirements of that paragraph, and Section 1111H2 requires an LEA that receives assistance under Title I, Part A to prepare and disseminate an annual LEA report card that includes certain specified information on the agency as a whole and each school served by the agency. 14. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the Accountability and State Plans final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the Accountability and State Plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. The Department has determined that each of these regulations is necessary to provide clarity with respect to provisions of the law that are vague or ambiguous, or to reasonably ensure that states and LEAs implement key requirements in Title I of the SEA, as amended by the ESA, particularly the requirements regarding accountability systems, state and LEA report cards, and consolidated state plans, consistent with the statute and with the statutory purpose of the law. In developing these regulations, we carefully considered each of the statutory restrictions on the Department's authority, including the restrictions in Section 1111E1A of the SEA, as amended by the ESA, as well as the more specific restrictions on the Department's authority to regulate particular aspects of statewide accountability systems in Section 1111E1B. We were also mindful of the fact that one of the goals of the reauthorization of the SEA through the ESA was to provide greater discretion and flexibility to states and LEAs than had been provided to them under the SEA, as amended by NCLB, and have taken steps to ensure that states and LEAs have significant discretion and flexibility with respect to how they implement these regulations. However, we disagree with the contention that any regulation that is not explicitly authorized by the statute and places any limitation on a state's or LEA's discretion either violates the specific statutory restrictions or is otherwise inconsistent with the statute. A regulation would be inconsistent with the statute if it were directly contrary to the statutory requirements, or if it would be impossible for a state or LEA to comply with both the statutory and regulatory requirements. Regulatory requirements that provide greater specificity regarding how a state must implement certain requirements are not inconsistent with the statute or the Department's rulemaking authority in any way. We similarly disagree with the contention that any of the regulations governing statewide accountability systems add new requirements that are outside the scope of Title I, Part A of the SEA, as amended by the ESA. All of the regulatory requirements governing statewide accountability systems fall squarely within the scope of Title I, Part A, as those requirements implement the statutory requirements in Sections 1111C and 1111D of the SEA, as amended by the ESA, and are specifically intended to ensure compliance with those sections. The fact that these regulations impose certain requirements for statewide accountability systems that are not specifically mentioned in those sections of the statute does not mean that those requirements fall outside the scope of Title I, Part A. Accordingly, the final regulations also do not violate Section 1111E of the SEA, as amended by the ESA, which prohibits the Secretary from promulgating any regulations that are inconsistent with or outside the scope of Title I, Part A. Moreover, given that the Secretary has general rulemaking authority, it is not necessary for the statute to specifically authorize the Secretary to issue a particular regulatory provision. Rather, the Secretary may issue any regulation governing Title I that is consistent with the SEA, as amended by the ESA, that enables the Secretary to carry out functions otherwise vested in the Secretary by law or by delegation of authority pursuant to law, and, with respect to regulations under Title I of the SEA, that the Secretary deems necessary to reasonably ensure that there is compliance with that title. 15. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the Accountability and State Plan's final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the Accountability and State Plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. In promulgating these regulations, the Secretary has exercised his authority under GEPA, the DOA, and under Section 16018 and 8302A of the SEA, as amended by the ESA, to issue regulations that are necessary to reasonably ensure that states, LEAs, and schools comply with the requirements for statewide accountability systems, consolidated state plans, and state and LEA report cards, and that they do so in a manner that advances the statutory goals. Changes: none. Comments: one commenter suggested that any of the department's proposed regulations that propose adding a requirement not expressly contained in the SEA, as amended by the ESA, might violate the spending clause of the U.S. Constitution, Article I, Section 8, Clause 1, by failing to provide clear notice to grantees of the requirements with which they must comply by accepting Title I funds. Discussion: Congress authority to enact the provisions in Title I of the SEA, as amended by the ESA, governing statewide accountability systems, report cards, and state plans flows from its authority to provide for general welfare of the United States. Article I, Section 8, Clause 1, commonly referred to as Congress spending authority. Under that authority, Congress authorized the Secretary to implement the provisions of the SEA, as amended by the ESA, and specifically authorized the Secretary to issue such regulations as are necessary to reasonably ensure that there is compliance with Title I. Thus, the regulations do not conflict with Congress authority under the spending clause. With respect to cases such as Arlington CSCH District BD of Eduk v. Murphy, states have full notice of their responsibilities under these regulations through the rulemaking process the department has conducted under the Administrative Procedure Act and the General Education Provisions Act to develop the regulations. Changes: none. Data collection comments: some commenters recommended removing paragraph 200.17, stating that the amount of data already collected has not improved academic achievement and that the federal government should not collect data on children. These comments were also made regarding paragraph 200.2024, 200.3031, 299.13, and 299.19 of the proposed regulations. In addition, a number of commenters recommended retaining paragraph 200.7 of the current regulations, which sets forth the data disaggregation and privacy requirements under the NCLB, without commenting specifically on proposed paragraph 200.17, which would establish similar requirements under the ESA. Discussion: the department believes that data collected for purposes of accountability and data reported on state and LEA report cards are important for providing parents and stakeholders the information they need to understand how schools are held accountable and how students, including each subgroup of students, are performing. Further, collecting these data is necessary to comply with the requirements of Section 1111 of the SEA, as amended by the ESA. In addition to promoting transparency, this information is essential for identifying and closing educational achievement gaps, which is one of the primary purposes of the law. We note that 16. Note: under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the Accountability and State Plan's final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the accountability and state plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. There are also multiple provisions in Title I of the ESEA, as amended by the ESA, including Section 1111C3, G, 2, N, and I, that specify privacy protections for individuals related to collection or dissemination of data consistent with Section 444 of the GEPA, 20 U.S.C. 1232G, commonly known as the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974. We further note, as we stated in the NPRM, that paragraph 200.17 retains and reorganizes the relevant requirements of current paragraph 200.7, which would be removed and reserved, so that these requirements, related to disaggregation of data primarily for accountability purposes, are incorporated into the sections of the final regulations pertaining to accountability, instead of pertaining to assessments. Changes, none. Section 200.12 Single Statewide Accountability System Comments. A number of commenters asked for clarity about the timeline under which a state will be required to implement a statewide accountability system, noting the distinction between the school year in which data are collected and the school year in which schools are differentiated and identified for support and improvement. Discussion. While we address specific comments related to the implementation timeline for the identification of schools in the statewide accountability system in paragraph 200.19, which begins no later than the 2018-2019 school year, in order to avoid confusion between the year in which a state collects data to calculate its indicators under paragraph 200.14 and the year in which a state first differentiates and identifies schools under paragraph 200.18 and 200.19, we have removed the reference to a specific year of implementation in paragraph 200.12. Changes. We revise paragraph 200.12A1 to strike, beginning no later than the 2017-2018 school year. Comments. One commenter suggested that the department create, through the regulatory process, an education office of the Ombudsman for each state that would be an independent organization to ensure fair, objective, and transparent investigations of complaints and that would resolve data and other disputes related to key elements of statewide accountability systems, including meaningful differentiation of all public schools and identification of schools to implement comprehensive or targeted support and improvement plans. Discussion. While we recognize that leads or schools may occasionally dispute accountability determinations under the ESEA, we believe that states are best positioned to determine an appropriate and timely process for resolving such disputes, which may include establishing an ombudsman's office for this purpose without the department requiring this. We decline to change the regulations in this area. Changes, none. Comments. Many commenters wrote either in support of or opposition to various aspects of the proposed regulations on statewide accountability systems, which are listed in paragraph 200.12, including indicators under paragraph 200.14 and school improvement plans under paragraph 200.21 and 200.22. 17. Note, under the Congressional Review Act, Congress has passed, and the President has signed, a resolution of disapproval of the accountability and state plans final regulations that were published on November 29, 2016, 81 FR 86076. The resolution of disapproval invalidates the accountability and state plan final regulations, which are no longer applicable. Discussion. We appreciate feedback in response to the high-level overview of statewide accountability systems in proposed paragraph 200.12. However, we address comments on specific components of the accountability system in the sections of the proposed regulations that address these specific components. Changes, none. Single system comments. A number of commenters wrote generally about the framework for a single statewide accountability system. Some supported and others opposed the creation of a single system. Commenters writing in opposition variously objected to the word single as not specifically authorized by the statute, described the proposed regulations as an overreach of the department's authority, and warned that the proposal, contrary to its stated purpose, would encourage separate state and federal accountability systems. Other commenters asserted that the requirement for a single statewide system would prevent states, LEAs, or charter schools from creating their own accountability systems, separate from the accountability system required under the ESEA, that are better tailored to local needs. Another commenter asked the department to provide guidance on how to reconcile conflicting school improvement identifications that may result from separate state and ESEA accountability systems. Finally, one commenter recommended that the regulations permit flexibility for rural schools and districts, suggesting, for example, that rural schools be overseen in accordance with state rural school laws, similar to the provisions in the statute in paragraph 200.12a for public charter schools. Discussion. We believe that a single statewide system is necessary to meet ESEA requirements, particularly for ensuring that annual meaningful differentiation and identification of schools is fair, consistent, and transparent to the public, and to ensure that all schools are treated equitably and held to the same expectations. However, the requirement for a single statewide system in paragraph 200.12 for federal accountability purposes does not preclude a state, LEA, or charter school organization from establishing a separate accountability system for its own purposes, including school identification and support, should such a system be required under state or local law, or desired for other reasons. Finally, it is not necessary for the ESEA, as amended by the ESA, to specifically authorize the Secretary to clarify that the statewide accountability system must be a single statewide accountability system, as this regulatory requirement is being promulgated pursuant to the Secretary's rulemaking authority under GEPA, the DOA, and Section 1601A of the ESEA, as amended by the ESA, and is fully consistent with Section 1111E of the ESEA, as amended by the ESA. See discussion of the Department's general rulemaking authority under the heading Cross Issues. Of this clarification, the statutory provision is ambiguous and could lead to unfair systems, annual meaning differentiation, education for schools, requirement to reasonably ensure compliance within the requirement. Changes. 18. Congressional review and the president of this plan that were published on November 20.
I'm gonna have to pause this. This is acting up.
R86.
I'm gonna pause the recording.